Well, here's a first. I'm gonna start a video by quoting scripture. All of this has happened before, and all of this will happen again. That's what it says right in the book of Pathia from Battlestar Galactica. But if you prefer a more down-to-earth holy book, you can refer to Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verses 9. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. The Buddhists have the concept of samsara, which is the endless cycle of existence, or as the war boys would put it, I live, I die, I live again. The bottom line is that originality is overrated.
Oh my god!
Just about everything is a remix or refinement of something someone else did before, and yet we still have such a hang-up about derivative works. We literally use the word derivative as an insult to a work of creative art. We call these things creative with the idea that the artist brings something from nothing, but the actual act of creativity is iterative. It's the art of doing something new with something old. Right now, the best example of that is a game called Nioh. It's absolutely tearing up the review scores, and the game is the talk of the town. But is Nioh just, wait for it, soulless ripoff? I'm sorry, I had to. When From Software released the first Dark Souls, they were actually riffing on themselves. Although a long line of their games from the PS1 and onward would shape Dark Souls, the preceding game Demon Souls almost had the Dark Souls formula we know and love down. It's a game still well worth the attention of any modern Soul fans. Something about the time, place, and exact design of Dark Souls created a perfect storm, which finally gave From global fame and success. To their extreme credit, they managed to battle lightning and kept the ball rolling with 2 more excellent Soul games, and 1 more spiritual title in the form of Bloodborne. The thing is, however, is when you come up with a great idea, it won't be long before other people try to get their slice of the pie. And that's how a game genre is birthed. Someone comes up with a new take on a game design, and enough people try to copy it that it becomes a class of game all on its own. After all, there had to be a first FPS, a first RTS, and so on. And guess what? The games that are most iconic to those genres are almost all copies of someone else's first attempt. Doom was far from the first FPS. It was just the first to nail the formula for a good FPS. Another great example is the MOBA. What started off as a mod for Warcraft 3 became one of the hottest game genres to attract every internet asshole tough guy alive. The MOBAs keep coming, but we really don't think of League of Legends as ripping off Dota as much as we used to.
Can you dig it?
Copying is a very natural phenomenon. It's a sort of natural selection for ideas. No one copies bad ideas. The ones that work are most likely to be reproduced. So the question is not whether something is completely original, but whether it sits on the right side of the fence between derivative and inspired. There are a lot of different examples that have landed on the right side of this debate. Shadow of Mordor, for example, is an amazing game that clearly channels both Assassin's Creed and the Rocksteady Batman games. But where it stood out was not only its polish, but its innovative Marauder system. As a matter of fact, Assassin's Creed started life as a new Prince of Persia game. While Diablo 1 and 2 became the archetype for action RPGs, games like Titan Quest and lately Grim Dawn and Exanima feel like fresh takes on the formula that are totally worth playing in their own right. Hilariously, some developers such as Squaresoft started life cloning Sega games for the NES. 3D World Runner is a Space Harrier ripoff, and Rad Racer which rips off Outrun. However, the first Final Fantasy may have never existed if it wasn't for Dragon Quest, which proves the idea that immature poets imitate, mature poets steal, as T.S. Eliot once said, which I take to mean that bad artists make blatant, crappy copies while true great artists own that shit. So with all that being said, is Nioh a ripoff or an inspired tribute? Whatever the case, it's a damn fine game in its own right. If you've ever played any of the Souls games, nothing but misplaced pride would keep you away from Team Ninja's hyper-fast fighter. It would also be a disservice to the developers who brought us Ninja Gaiden, the king of punishing games. What Nioh does is it takes the DNA of the Souls series and infuses it with more mechanical depth and arguably a different feel. The game's development actually predicates Dark Souls' release date by a long shot. Nioh began life as a game based on an unfinished Akira Kurosawa film titled Oni. When it was just announced the game was going to be made by Koei. That means it's been 12 years and a few development teams from when we first heard of this game to the release of the alpha. The game was actually set to be released under the Nioh title back in 2006. Team Ninja only took over development in 2010. Yeah, this game has been on an almost Duke Nukem Forever kind of trip. The most obvious difference you can see just at face value is, well, the setting. While the Soul games are set in a dark, western, medieval mythology, Nioh is built on Japanese mythology. That means if the lore and cultural pillars of Dark Souls are very important to you, Nioh may not scratch that itch entirely. Personally, I think it's good for games to differentiate themselves on a visual and stylistic level, which Nioh soars at. While tight combat and punishing difficulty is something that Team Ninja has shown they can do in their previous games, Nioh is not an exact carbon copy of Dark Souls. Yes, there are some similarities, but it is the differences that really stand out from the perspective of someone looking for that next game to give them a true challenge. For one thing, the speed of combat in Nioh is much closer to a Gaiden game or a tad faster paced Bloodborne than Dark Souls. The incorporation of 3 weapon stances that can change on the fly turns combat into a Zen-like balance. It means that combat can be incredibly varied and change in the blink of an eye, from high stance allowing for slow but heavy damage to light stance for fast attacks with low damage. Each of these stances, including the medium stance, have different animations for every weapon type, and with a huge array of unlockable skills, Nioh allows you to further customize your character's attack combos. Nioh apes the stamina system in Dark Souls, but completely changes the rhythm of combat by introducing the Ki Pulse ability, which allows you to manipulate stamina regeneration rates. In Dark Souls, that's a passive feature, but in Nioh, it's especially important because the penalty for letting Ki run out is usually death, since you become immobilized until you can catch your breath. Add on top of this the ability to Ki Pulse during dodging and while changing stances, and after hours of practice, you will find a whole new level of meta game as you create vast combo strings by switching stances and Ki Pulsing in between attacks with your weapons. Nioh balances this out with clever modifications of its enemies by letting you see the enemy's ki levels as well. This means Nioh's enemies are bound by the same rule set that you are and can become fatigued by their attack strings and being hit by you. Outside of learning the attack patterns of enemies and wind-up animations, Nioh puts an emphasis on patience, wearing down your target by dodging their attacks before making the killing blow. While it's mostly the combat of Nioh that evokes Dark Souls, the structure of the game is not as open as Dark Souls is. It's been structured into missions, which makes it more like Devil May Cry in terms of overall progression, instead of an open world like Dark Souls 3. However, Nioh still does take a page out of Dark Souls' level design through the usage of finding shortcuts, which are placed to encourage exploration and give bursts of relief and eureka moments as they help explain the level's dungeon-like design and hopefully a shrine that they can use to recover. Bow and gun aiming mechanics are a lot better in Nioh than they are in Dark Souls, and also makes it possible to take the stealth route at range from time to time. The loot system in Nioh takes more from ARPGs like Diablo more than any Souls games, which has never really relied on gear. After all, the best Dark Souls players can beat the entire game naked. And even with all that being said, there are even more differences that we could spend another hour talking about. Things like ninjutsu, yokai realm area debuffs, spirit animals, twilight missions, the actual narrative, and more. And I think you're getting the point. The bottom line is, after playing both betas and playing the final game for at least close to 50 hours, I've come to believe that Nioh fully deserves to stand side by side with Dark Souls as a shining example of perhaps a new subgenre that has yet to be properly named. The past gives a lot of insight into this possibility. If you can recall, Doom clones ultimately became first-person shooters, and the new Doom has been referred to as a 90s shooter due to how vastly different it plays from other modern shooters. Diablo clones became action RPG dungeon crawlers, and after playing nothing but Nioh for the past week, I've begun to think that we'll soon find out what to call games that remind us so strongly of games like Dark Souls.